I want to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. As a CEO, there are days when my calendar feels like a never-ending cascade of decisions, meetings, and problems to solve. Days when I can't remember if I've eaten lunch. The last thing I have time to think about is currency exposure. This is where Alt21 can help by taking the complexity out of foreign exchange. With their FX and hedging platform, you can lock in exchange rates and automate payments. And with their low fees, up to 90% less than competitors, you'll save money while freeing up your time for what really matters. If you want to stop juggling and start focusing on growing your business, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Amy C. Edmondson, is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School. Ranked number 1 in the latest Thinkers 50 of the world's most influential management thinkers, Amy introduced the idea of psychological safety, now universally recognized. She is the author of 7 books, including The Fearless Organization and Right Kind of Wrong, which won the 2023 FT Book of the Year. Amy has also authored over 60 scholarly papers published in academic and management outlets such as Administrative Science Quarterly, Academy of Management Journal, and Harvard Business Review. Amy, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Amy, for those in board positions who are not yet familiar with psychological safety and why it's important, can you briefly summarize why this has been such a breakthrough insight and why that matters for board members, both in the boardroom and in their organizations?
Let's see if I can do this succinctly. So first, psychological safety describes an environment, an interpersonal climate, if you will, where people believe it's safe to speak up honestly with candor. It's a sense of permission for candor. It's probably best thought of as a learning environment, an environment where you can ask dumb questions, admit mistakes, challenge other people's points of view. So it's an environment, quite frankly, where high-quality conversations can happen. Now, I think it's obvious why that would matter in a board environment. Boards make big decisions, strategic decisions, including decisions about who should run the company. Those decisions are always being made in the face of uncertainty. And if you don't have a high quality conversation in making those decisions, you will not be making the best possible decision, which is essentially a bet in the face of uncertainty. So psychological safety simply describes an environment where people are more concerned about the quality of the conversation than about how they look. Now, it seems a little strange to say, oh, people would be worried about how they look, especially very senior people. And I mean that in a rather subtle way. I mean that we all want and naturally want to be thought well of by others, but we fail to realize how much that subtle desire to manage others' impressions of us can limit our willingness to say candid things. And I mean, I'll just add the rest of the organization. Board members should care that the organizations that they govern have learning environments where they can innovate effectively, pursue quality improvement effectively, and serve customers effectively. And all of that thrives in a more psychologically safe environment.
It's interesting listening to you talk about it. We measure psychological safety using a weekly pulse in the organization. And it's something I've always been really proud that we've always been top decile in where we score on that. But listening to you talk about it there and that awareness, it reminds me a bit of one of our past guests, Dan Gardner, the author of Super Forecasting and How Big Things Get Done, where he was talking about bias and how you can't do anything about bias. It's there. Even if you're aware of it, it's still there. And the way you're just talking about there about that fear, can we actually overcome that instinctive loss aversion?
That's interesting. It's similar to bias. You cannot fully overcome it, but when you know it's there, you will mitigate the risk it produces. Right? So it's more about operating on those two levels at once, right? Knowing that you're vulnerable to holding back relevant content for fear of offending. And once you are explicit in knowing that risk exists, you're less at risk. because you realize, well, that's crazy, right? It's obviously more important that we make a really good decision about this very important issue than offending someone's feelings.
Okay, so I was talking to a very seasoned chair recently about psychological safety, referencing your work, Project Aristotle, and the importance of it for running in the organization. And they laughed at me. I was just slightly disappointed. They said, that's just grandiose speak for inclusiveness. And I didn't have the opportunity to set them straight on that. But I imagine, and actually I think you reference it in the Phyllis organization, it's a question you often get, isn't psychological safety just? What's your answer?
It's hard for me to know exactly what this person meant by inclusiveness, because inclusiveness can have, in some people's minds, a sort of derogatory connotation where it means for the goal of inclusiveness, we're sort of sacrificing the goal of performance, which of course is not the only and not even a very good way to look at it, right? In fact, one could make a strong argument that in most cases, the goal of performance requires inclusiveness, by which I mean the inclusion of diverse perspectives, the ability to look at this from multiple sides so that we make a good decision in the face of uncertainty. But psychological, what I hear more often, and I think maybe underlying that comment is, oh, yeah, Google did all this research in psychological safety. That's just about being nice. And sure, that's fine. But that's not as important as performance. And so, first of all, it's suffering from a misconception about what psychological safety is. I think it's best thought of as permission for candor. And you right away realize that means permission to feel a little uncomfortable and even the expectation of feeling a little uncomfortable. Because what we're doing here, after all, is hard. It's work. And if you take psychological safety to mean everyone will feel included and happy and comfortable all the time, then absolutely, we don't have time for that. Or at least that puts us at risk if that's the kind of environment we have. Whereas I'm saying, and I think the measures accurately capture an environment which is almost deliberately uncomfortable. I'm going to speak up about this mistake I made, not because I enjoy doing that, I don't, but because I believe it matters to us. And sooner is better than later.
But let's say that there's board members listening to this right now thinking, gosh, Amy, I've read your books. They're great. I've bought into psychological safety and the impact that it's going to have on the performance of the organization. But what should I be looking for as a board member to ascertain where we are as an organization?
That's a great question. And because in fact, I'm trying hard to fight against people thinking of psychological safety as a goal, because it's not. It's just a means to a goal. So you tell me the goal that your board has, and of course it has something to do with really good governance of a complex organization, but it might lean toward more innovation or more excellence in execution. Whatever the goal is, I can definitely draw a line toward that goal that runs through psychological safety. But here in the board itself, I think the best way, because I think your job is high quality conversations to make high quality decisions. So the best self-assessment is this. What is the quality of our conversations? And I'll offer 3 attributes that I think you can reflect on. The first is, does it seem that people are sharing what they know honestly and openly? If someone is not talking at this moment, do they seem to be listening? Are they fully engaged? Are they on their phone or thinking about something else or waiting till it's their turn to speak? The first attribute of a high quality conversation is that people are either contributing useful things or listening. The second attribute is that there's a healthy balance of what Chris Argyr has called advocacy and inquiry, statements and questions. And if you're listening to the conversation and people are making statement after statement, but there's no genuine digging into, wait, walk me through that. Tell me why you see it that way, or what are customers saying, or what other way is there to think about this? So a healthy balance of both makes for a high quality conversation. And third, you have a subjective sense that you're getting somewhere, that the conversation is progressing forward, that you feel that you're learning as a result of being part of this conversation, and you suspect other people are learning as well, and you're getting closer to a good decision or closer to something we might call the truth about the matter or the best bet we can possibly make. So I think you can self-assess on all 3 dimensions, just give it an arbitrary 1 to 5 scale. And if you're sensing that those scale, that you're scoring low on those three scales, that is likely pointing to an absence of psychological safety. People may be holding back. People are not willing to ask questions. They fear they look naive if they ask questions. And also the thing seems to be going around in circles. And guess what? Nobody's saying it's going around in circles. Those will be low scores.
A couple of years ago, we went through, unfortunately, some redundancies, and we could see our psychological safety drop off a cliff. And it's been surprising to me how long it has taken to recover. And it is now happily back to where it was. Are there predictable events that trigger drops in psychological safety in your experience?
Yes, and certainly redundancies is a big one. And there's two kinds of redundancies. One is redundancies that just happened and they're under-managed or there isn't a lot of sense-making and sense-giving, I should say, from leadership. So then people are free to make sense of themselves, and suddenly the world and the company seems more frightening, right? So understandably, there'll be a drop. The other kind of redundancy is the well-managed redundancy. I'm not saying redundancies will ever be happy news for anyone, but when they are carefully explained and managed and people are given as much compassion and help on the way out. And these are adults. By definition, you are employing adults, not children. And so treat them as adults. I mean, people understand that gravity exists, right? They understand that the revenues have dropped or that a new market didn't work out, whatever it is. I mean, they might not be happy about it, but they can understand that this was something we had to do for the health of the business. And for those of us still here, the question becomes, how do we work together to build the best possible value for our customers? All events in organizations need help from leadership to help people make the right sense of them, not the wrong sense. Because if people are making the conclusion like, okay, this is now a scarier place than I thought, so now I'm going to hold back my ideas, questions, concerns, and mistakes, guess what? I mean, ironically, now they're at more risk of underperforming, which puts them at greater risk of redundancy, say, in their own future. Whereas if they understand, okay, that was really hard for me and my colleagues, and they really need us now more than ever, and this is what good looks like. Good looks like leaning in candidly with ideas, questions, concerns, and mistakes, then we'll be better off. So are there I think it's hard to think of another event as important or obvious as redundancies for lowering psychological safety, but one that we've been thinking a lot about recently is simply, with or without the pandemic, the shift to more remote work can also put a damper on psychological safety simply because it puts a slightly higher hurdle on just speaking up. Right? Do I go so far as to set up a video meeting with people? I can't just walk by and see if you look busy and say, I've been thinking about this thing.
That's interesting. And have you seen how organizations have been able to counter that? What's the solution?
Being more deliberate, more proactive, right? Because it's certainly not to say, don't do that. Don't do remote work. Sometimes that is a very smart design decision. But it is to say, when you're doing that, structure is your friend. Whether structure is certain kinds of check-ins, weekly office hours, kind of sort of the equivalent of a standing meeting, whatever it is, your group has to design what you need. And then you have to lean in far more explicitly to inquiry than you otherwise might. I mean, assume it's so easy. And I'm sitting here on a screen and a bunch of other people sitting on a screen. And by the way, I might as well do my email while I'm at it because this is a little dull. And there's all sorts of things I might just be at risk for not sharing that could have been mission critical. We then have to sort of lean into things like rounds, or Amy, what are you seeing? What ideas do you have? Heavier hand, heavier facilitation, if you will.
So for a board member listening now, thinking, okay, I need to think about how we can increase the psychological safety in our board, what advice would you offer them?
I think instead of saying, how do we increase the psychological safety, say, how do we increase the quality of the conversation? And I think the very first thing you would want to do is ask more and better questions and institute formal moments of reflection or of pause. What are we missing? Or what could go wrong? And the old pre-mortem that, okay, this sounds good. Everybody seems to be on board. Now, just for fun, let's pause for a moment and just say it's 3 months from now or 6 months from now, whatever the best time frame might be for this decision. And it was a fiasco. We got this wrong. Now, I don't really want to believe that, but I'm just saying thought experiment. We got it wrong. And then you say, what did we miss? Or what were the likely factors that explained this now certain failure? And that just generates a different kind of thinking, right? Instead of people sort of feeling, yep, this sounds good, people are feeling, okay, how do I show how clever I am? So then they have to say, and then they say some of the things that was in the back of their mind to say, we only did 3 customer interviews, whatever it is, right? So that's that kind of technique to just be a little more self-critical, or another way to put that is just a little more curious, a little less knowing and a little more learning.
That feels like that ties in with one of the ideas that jumped out of me from Phyllis' organization of the importance of shifting from a belief into that incompetences are the root of the issue versus the system. So by assuming that there is a problem and then opening it up, you've removed the personal blame.
That's right. In a way, you've introduced a false certainty because we're just pretending for the moment that this is a certain fiasco. So now I get to shift to, I don't have to worry about being the skunk at the picnic. I now get to shift to, am I smart enough to help explain?
It's interesting that ties neatly with Roger Martin uses that in his sort of playing to win. What would have to be true is his question. And that effectively sort of unlocks passionate beliefs on what we need to do to, okay, we're assuming this now, let's work together to imagine.
Just know that you are making assumptions of which you're unaware. That's the whole definition of an assumption is, right? Some underlying taken for granted belief of which you're unaware. Just know they're there and then say, I wonder which ones they are. Which of the things that we are believing to be true are in fact merely assumptions. And that's a team sport.
I was really struck by the example that you have written about of Julia Morath, the COO at Children's Hospital and Clinic in Minneapolis, and the subtlety of some of the things that you identified that she was doing around setting the stage. So when she uses language to talk about not an investigation, but a study of an adverse event, not an error, but an accident or a failure, to depersonalize things. Are there other techniques, tactics like that you see as being particularly helpful for board members to think about as they think about?
Yes. To be setting the stage is a combination of, it's about trying to create shared meaning in advance as opposed to waiting till getting us all on the same page, that we have a shared understanding of what we're up against, of the nature of the work we do and so forth. So in a board, just shared meaning about the actual uncertainty that lies ahead. Our brains and our habits are just so predisposed to kind of knowing and seeing certainty where none exists. And what the Morath example, I think, shows very nicely is that language is really powerful. Just getting into the habit of reflecting on the terms that you use. For example, at NASA, during the shuttle program, their conversations were consumed with language that would be very appropriate for a production facility, not an R&D facility. And it talked about routines and schedules, and even the word shuttle is enormously, that describes a very precisely repeating event. That language starts to then make it hard for people to speak up when they have a dissenting view or a worry, because senior leadership has conveyed that we've got this, right? This is all about hitting the deadlines, meeting our targets, and it's routine. And when something goes a little bit wrong, it's a maintenance issue, not a safety of flight issue, for example. So language plays a powerful role in shaping our frames about what we think is really going on, and in ways that, reinforcing assumptions that we don't even know are assumptions. And so setting the stage is about just pausing to be scientific, rational. What are we up against? Some new markets that we don't know enough about, some new technologies that may or may not work perfectly the first time. Let's talk about it. When we've set the stage with sort of reality-based thinking, we're now realize that our job is to lean in to help each other learn and to help each other figure it out. It's a puzzle, not a performance.
The other thing that you talked about in that example was responding productively. And as well as expressing appreciation, you talked about sanctioning clear violations. And I've just been leading a session with our leadership team and all our managers on how to do good development discussions with people. And one of the questions that came up was around, I talked about the importance of mastery, autonomy, purpose, creating the sense of autonomy when people are giving feedback. And I think it's the same in a boardroom. If you start imposing too much on the executive, you take away that autonomy. But if they are clearly doing something wrong, when do you step in? I'm really interested to hear in that, related to that, sanctioning clear violations. How do you go about that whilst maintaining that psychological safety?
It partly, let's go back to stage setting, because it's enormously helpful if you have set the stage with clarity about where the boundaries are. Now, some boundaries are self-evident, although it doesn't help to mention them as well, meaning don't break the law, don't harass or bully. But again, I think one of the most important leadership tasks in a board, in a company, are to be very clear about where the boundaries are, what we expect. Even some organizations are very keen on expecting sort of respect and decency in interactions, like we don't yell or what have you. And now that, again, you might think that's obvious to everyone, but it's not a bad idea to be clear about it, because then you are far better set up to be clear about the violation. And so, but assuming sufficient clarity at the outset about where the boundaries are around conduct and spending limits, et cetera, then the answer to the question becomes as soon as possible, right? You say when. It's sort of as soon as you see even a small violation of a standard that we hold. It's hard to talk about, but it's a lot easier than when it becomes a big violation. And so you just try to nip it in the bud, right? So, and it's not mean, it's just clear. Clear is kind. It's just one to hold up the mirror for a moment, just give that little bit of feedback.
Trying to think what that would look like in practice in a board. I guess would an example be where a CEO has overinvested in a project and gone above a limit that you'd agreed you wouldn't do
without checking.
Checking, they may be being successful. Lots of boards would just let them wave them through and say, "Oh, they're doing a good job." But actually, what you're saying there is you should be making that.
Yes, and it's just let's make sure we understand it. What led to that decision? Now, it could be the CEO made 10 phone calls and got no one. No one was available, and it was an urgent thing, and the CEO believed it was really important and timely. And those are those moments where I'll ask forgiveness later, different than an ethical violation, likely, in our minds. But first understand it. First understand what happened, and then express concern. Doesn't have to be a one shot, you're out, but do express concern and why. There is a worry. What's the board for? If the board says things or there are decisions made about the company, governance of the company, and they're completely ignored, then what's the board for? So we can have this conversation, not an easy conversation to have, but it is one that can be had. The productive response is first and foremost forward-looking, right? It's worried about what will happen next. So if it's a productive response to sanction out-of-bounds behavior, primarily because we don't want it to happen again. Our concern is not to punish or to be mean, but to ensure the future success of the company. An appreciative and forward-looking response on something that was good is one that is genuinely appreciative and enthusiastic, so that we see more of that. So I think our tendency with feedback, and even think of the word feedback, is that we're looking backwards. Now, we're using the data of the past, preferably the recent past, to shape the future.
And forward.
Feed forward. Exactly. It's a very important distinction. And as for performance management conversations at all levels, but especially at higher levels, nothing is more important than the mindset of we're on the same page here. We're on the same side of the table looking forward together. This isn't me against you, me evaluating you. Are you good enough? And then you're thinking, who is she to judge? And if I say something critical that you don't agree with, you believe it to be undiscussable, you don't say anything, and the whole process becomes a sham. Versus you and I are both, I'm your manager, say, but I'm trying to clarify what I need from you, but you have to clarify what you need from me too. Like what kind of help, how much feedback, how frequent meetings, what kind of input, because both of us are deeply invested in your success, because my success is dependent on your ability to perform a set of tasks. And so if we can approach this conversation not as enemies, but as team members looking forward, we will have a higher quality conversation.
Brings us on nicely to the third part of that, setting the stage, responding productively and inviting participation. I think one of the most difficult things for board members when you're there ostensibly often as the expert to come up and challenge the executive without breaking that sense of psychological safety. And you talk about the importance of demonstrating situational humility. What in your mind does that look like for a board member? If you were sitting on my board and about to challenge me, what would that look like?
It would first, I'd have to remind myself that I have a valid point of view and I am necessarily missing things because none of us are omniscient. And you have a valid point of view and you're also missing things. So my goal must be to learn and educate. And hopefully that's yours too. And we will have a higher quality result if we do that. If my goal is to show you how smart I am and how stupid you are, I promise you that won't work. It might look like it's working, but it won't work because there just isn't a universe in which you're going to agree with me that the problem is you, not me.
That's interesting. I think some of the best board members I've worked with actually not only say that to themselves, I've heard them articulate it out loud.
Yeah. I'm all for articulating it out loud. I think the more explicit we make these reframes, the better off we are.
You have a brilliant Q&A section at the back of the Fearless organization where you share your responses to many of the questions you most commonly get, which made preparing for this fiendishly difficult because all the nice questions had already been covered. But there was one in there that really grabbed me and that I've often sort of wrestled with, which is when I look at many of the most successful organizations that we have in the world today, those led by the Bezoses, the Musks, the Jobs of this world, and you read their biographies, it doesn't always feel like they are organizations imbued with psychological safety. You respond to that challenge very articulately in the book and say, look, there may be the occasional genius, but are you going to take the chance that you've got that on your board? And I suppose the question for me is, how do people work out whether this is an evil genius they can live with or one that they need to do something about?
I think it's not as binary as all that. So there isn't much of a downside to assuming or believing that the evil genius is also, and maybe not even evil, maybe just a little bit blind to his impact. But this sort of extraordinary genius, this sort of once in a generation type talent who indeed creates something extraordinary, an Apple computer or what have you, there is still the counterfactual, right? And can you really argue that Jobs is better off not listening to the input of the other, maybe not as genius as he is, but the other very smart, capable people that he has hired? It's a little hard for me to make the argument that he's better off not listening than listening and doing with it what you want. Right? The counterfactual for Apple is an easy one. Would Apple have gone into its dark time of near-death experience and then Jobs getting kicked out of the company had Jobs been a slightly better leader in that era? Also, according to Ed Catmull, he did come back as a very changed person who was extraordinarily good at sort of rallying the troops. And he still had his ideas and standards and wouldn't take no for an answer very often, but he understood that others' voices mattered as well. So that's even in those extreme cases, they are often, you can make the good case that they'd be better off were they actively listening to diverse inputs from within.
Can we talk about one of the ideas that also came up in the Fearless organization, which you built on in The Right Kind of Wrong, around the different types of failure archetypes, which I thought was really interesting? You just, for those not familiar with those, explain what they are and then relate them to how board members can take value from that.
I think it's very important for board members because honestly, the failure is a very loaded term, and most of us, really all of us, would prefer to succeed than to fail in any day of the week. We want to be right, not wrong, and so on. However, most of us also fail to thoughtfully distinguish between the different kinds of failure. And I identify three types. One are basic failures, which are in familiar territory with a single cause, usually a mistake. And indeed, they are utterly preventable. And when we're at our best, we prevent them. We're vigilant, we're thoughtful, we speak up, etc. And those are preventable bad things. Complex failures are multi-causal, where any one of the causes on its own wouldn't create a failure, but the unfortunate combination of factors led to a failure. A supply chain breakdown, for example, caused by weather patterns, absenteeism, handful of things coming together in just the wrong way. Those two really well-run systems, by and large, can prevent complex failures. The third kind are intelligent failures, and these are the undesired results of thoughtful experiments in new territory. Those we must not only love, we should probably have more of them if we want to be innovative, if we want to invent the future or invent the things that allow us to succeed in the future. I think boards, if they don't have that vocabulary, don't have that categorization, are at risk for overreacting to all failures the same way. We have a new product launch that smart people believed was going to be a success, and it wasn't. That cannot be responded to in the same way as someone causing an accident because they didn't require safety procedures to be followed. And so it's about the wisdom to know the difference and then to respond productively and to promote risk-taking, smart risk-taking. And so that, which will invariably include some failures, but an intelligent failure is one that's no bigger than necessary. So you don't invest all the resources you have in an uncertain endeavor. You test it as small as you can, just big enough to get us that next step forward.
One of the many light bulb moments I had reading this was when you talked about the electric maze experiment. Do you want to talk more about that? Because
Yes.
that just really rammed home for me how you might think differently about intelligent failures.
This is sort of a team exercise that I will often do in the classroom, and it's a wonderful metaphor for innovation, for taking risks in new territory. So it's just a grid. It's a rug that looks like a graph paper, and it's 9 by 6, if the 9 squares by 6 squares. Some of the squares, when you step on them, emit an annoying electrical beep, and some of them are quiet. And the team's assignment is to find the path of non-beeping squares, contiguous squares through the maze from one side to the other. And what happens is, as a team member, a student is on the front lines, right? They get to a point in the maze where we don't yet know where the quiet squares are. I will see them time and time again hovering. And by the way, it's a timed exercise, right? So time is really precious, and more often than not, they will run out of time before they solve the problem. So they're hovering 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20. So and that's very problematic to their performance. So in the debrief, I say, what were you thinking? And every student has the opportunity to be on the maze. They rotate through. And what goes through your head when you're on the front lines there? And they invariably say, I didn't want to make a mistake. Or occasionally, I didn't want to let the team down. So they're hesitating. Now that hesitation is costly, as I already said, but it's illogical also because nobody knows, right? There's absolutely no way to discover the beeps without stepping. So it's a classic trial and error exercise. And the way to get it done well and quickly is to be very systematic. Just step, right? No delay at all. Let's say start on the left and make your way across until you've discovered the whole territory. By the way, so then in the debrief, I call it a beep going forward. Okay, a beep going forward is not penalized. It doesn't cost anything. It's free. So then I say, okay, why are we doing this silly thing? I want you to, next time you're leading an innovation team, realize that the social psychology of this is really problematic, right? People are afraid to get the data they need to solve the problem because they don't want to be wrong. They don't want to make a mistake. They don't want to let the team down. And so their self-talk is inherently problematic. And by the way, the team's reaction, the team will groan when you get a beep, and the team will erupt in applause when you get it
If you've
right.
done something clever.
Right. And you haven't done anything clever. You just got lucky, right? Like all data are equally valuable. Right? And it is an eye-opener for them because they realize the natural human reaction is at odds with this thing they say they value, which is innovation. But innovation is actually hard because it means journeying in new territory. And journeying in new territory will bring beeps. So it becomes a metaphor for them afterwards. It's like it's just a beep going forward. Beeps going backwards are different, Those are mistakes. We should know better. But the beeps going forward are just data.
It reminds me of one of the tensions that I often see or have seen in the past between us sales and customer-facing teams and the product and engineering teams, where the latter tend to take more of what I call the physicist's approach, where they're designing from first principles, and the former tend to take more of the biologist's approach, where they're simply just A/B testing. And in some situations, one approach will be best than the other. The challenge is knowing which situation you're facing. Are you in an electric maze, or is actually there a code that you can unpick?
That's right. And in fact, it's a great thing because in the maze, I mean, to get into more detail, which I probably shouldn't, but I say once you have found the path through, and you can only have one person on the maze at a time to find the path, then your job, and this isn't in the book, but then your job is to get everyone through the path. And the bright ones realize right away that the best way to do that is like a conga line, right? Just literally my hand on your shoulder so that I cannot make a mistake, because now we have known territory, and now speed and efficiency rather than discovery and exploration are the game. That's really a profound mindset shift, knowing which kind of context is this? Is this a context for exploration and quick data collection, or is this a context for perfect execution on a known path?
You wrote about several organization failures at Volkswagen with the emissions scandal, at Wells Fargo, where they had the cross-selling scandal, at Nokia, where they failed to get their R&D right, and at the New York Federal Reserve Bank, where they experienced what you called regulatory capture as failures born essentially from the absence of psychological safety. Really interested to hear, had you been sort of sitting on those boards or advising board members, might they have done differently?
Bottom line, they should have been, or could have been, I'll say, a lot more curious. For example, the Wells Fargo sales numbers were astonishingly close to what was being requested. Right? Now, I know people like to hit targets, but they were, if you really pause, even for a few minutes, to think, how many customers need 7 different financial services products from us, right? So one should, and also, let's back up. Think about the messaging in the first place. So the CEO messaging was 8 is great. You should, because we're starting to run out of customers, new customers. So let's just sell the ones we have more products. That's one way to grow. And he was absolutely clear that was what was expected. You must cross-sell and you must keep increasing that number of products per customer. And there didn't seem to be any, if it's possible, it's just this is what you will do. So I think as a board member, you have to be very thoughtful about the language that you're hearing. To what extent is this an achievable goal? Is this an aspiration? What are the implied or explicit punishments if you fail to achieve this goal? Realize that when there's a stretch goal without a clear scientific rationale for its achievability, then you are at risk, at least, of cover-up and fraud. You're just at risk. I'm not saying it will happen, but you're at risk of it happening. So be a bit more thoughtful about magical goals and a little bit more curious about how people are set up to achieve them. Be more curious about customers' real needs rather than the needs we're trying to impose on them. Similarly for Dieselgate, I'd love to see this. How does it work? How did you manage to be the first company to develop a diesel engine that could pass these regulatory standards and so on? So be a little bit more engaged in especially the novel innovation puzzles of the company. A little bit more pushing back on, okay, what could go wrong here? What might we be missing and so forth. I think Nokia is a classic example of resting on their laurels. It said nothing fails like success. They were hugely successful in their industry and thought, here's the phone. We've got it. Everybody loves it. Failed to think, what will tomorrow's phone look like and who's going to get there first? And people who in engineering were sort of eager to express such thoughts felt very much shut down. Maybe it's the board's responsibility, again, back to psychological safety, to make sure that this is an organization that has enormous attention to detecting weak signals. We want to make sure our top management team has both awareness and processes or tools to be detecting the truth. There's a great article in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week about NVIDIA and Jensen Huang using a technique he calls TFT, top 5 things. And he just wants everyone in the company to weekly send him an email. Here are the top 5 things I'm worrying about, thinking about, working on, etc. And he actually reads them, and they have led him to realize things that they needed to be thinking about doing, changing, and so forth. And he explicitly talks about it as a weak signal detector.
Amy, time has flown by, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready. Best book every board member should read, and why?
Bad Blood, the story of Theranos, and primarily because the board plays a central starring role in that book. Their failure to be curious, their failure to question in a deep way what was really going on is really very much responsible for that failure.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Posturing, taking all the air out of the room with long speeches to look good.
Most valuable board ritual?
The pre-mortem.
Your favorite quote?
This is a quote from Buckminster Fuller. It's in the frontispiece of his book Synergetics. Dare to be naive.
Your most significant professional insight?
Probably that there are profound differences across groups within organizations in their willingness to speak up honestly.
The worst professional advice you ever received?
Don't keep studying healthcare. It's not a real business.
What have you changed your mind about regarding boards over time?
What I've changed my mind about is that boards rarely are well designed and well managed to do the job that they're there for, which is governance, which is helping guide the organization forward in an uncertain world. So this isn't finding fault so much as observing that oftentimes the design, the composition, the incentives are not present to enable them to do that important job.
Systemic issues versus incompetence.
Yes.
How are you better today as an academic than when you started?
I am more able and willing to take on big questions.
Amy, I've always thought I should have gone to business school in the US, and the privilege of talking to you now has just confirmed that thinking even more. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your incredible wisdom and experience. Building a non-exec career is hard. For those starting out, boards can be opaque. For more experienced board members, it can be lonely and hard to stay match fit. Having placed almost 4,000 people on boards in the last 5 years, we know what success looks like. It requires time, energy, resilience, information, and connections. New Role Plus, our community of board peers, exists to give you these things, offering you wholesale support as you try to get board roles and become a standout Ned. Find out more at newrole.com/newrole-plus. That's newrole.com/newrole-plus.